Puddle Lane. The Gruffle in Puddle Lane. The Gruffle in Puddle Lane. The Gruffle was a gruff and grumpy monster. He was very grumpy and he was very gruff. He didn't often come to the garden of the old house in Puddle Lane, but when he did, everyone was careful not to make him cross. The difficulty was that the Gruffle could vanish whenever he wanted to, and if he was invisible, no one could see him. But when they did see the Gruffle in the garden, everyone tried to be very quiet and careful. The Gruffle was a gruff and grumpy monster. He was very grumpy and he was very gruff. A blackbird lived in a tree in the garden of the old house. The blackbird liked to sing every morning, but he never sang if he saw the Gruffle. The Gruffle didn't like to hear anyone singing. A blackbird lived in a tree in the garden. The blackbird liked to sing. An owl lived in the attic of the old house. He often hooted as he flew out of the window, toot-toot, but he always flew silently away if he saw the Gruffle. The Gruffle didn't like to hear anyone hooting. An owl lived in the attic. The owl liked to hoot. One day, very early in the morning, the Gruffle was in the garden of the old house. The owl saw the Gruffle, as he flew home to the attic, and he was careful not to hoot. The blackbird was up, but he didn't sing. He sat on a branch and watched the Gruffle. The Gruffle went to the garden gate. He looked through the gate into Puddle Lane. There was no one about. The Gruffle opened the gate and went into the lane. One day the Gruffle was out in the garden. He opened the gate and went into Puddle Lane. Old Mr. Gotobed woke up early in his house in Puddle Lane. He didn't feel very well, so he didn't get dressed. He went downstairs and made a cup of tea and took the tea back to bed. But the milk had gone sour. When old Mr. Gotobed tasted his tea, it wasn't right at all. Old Mr. Gotobed opened his window. He made a cup of tea. The tea was not right. Mr. Gotobed opened his window. The Gruffle was in the lane just under Mr. Gotobed's window. Only the Gruffle's ears were showing. The rest of him was invisible. Mr. Gotobed wouldn't have seen him, even if he had looked out of the window. But he didn't look out of the window. He tossed out the tea without looking. Swoosh! The tea fell on the Gruffle's head. Do not disturb. Mr. Gotobed tossed the tea out of the window. Swoosh! The tea fell on the Gruffle's head. The Gruffle roared. He gave a great roar of rage and came into view. He stood there in the lane under Mr. Gotobed's window. Mr. Gotobed could see him now. He could hear him too, for the Gruffle roared again. I'm dreaming, cried Mr. Gotobed. I'm having a nightmare. I must be still asleep. I'll go back to bed. Mr. Gotobed saw the Gruffle. The Gruffle roared. Mr. Gotobed ran back to his bed. He climbed in and pulled the sheet over his head. The Gruffle roared again. He went off down the lane, feeling crosser than ever. Mr. Gotobed put his fingers in his ears and stayed under the sheet. Mr. Gotobed ran back to bed. The Gruffle roared again and went down the lane. Mr. Puffle got up early that morning. He was feeling very cheerful. Mr. Puffle began to sing. He picked up his watering can and opened his window to water the flowers in the window box outside. Mr. Puffle got up. He began to sing. Mr. Puffle opened his window. He picked up his watering can. But the Gruffle was in the lane. Just at that moment, the Gruffle went by Mr. Puffle's house. He heard Mr. Puffle singing, and he looked up with a roar of rage. Mr. Puffle looked out and saw the Gruffle. Mr. Puffle was so surprised that he dropped the watering can. The Gruffle was in the lane. Mr. Puffle dropped the watering can. The watering can fell on the Gruffle's head. The Gruffle roared and roared again. Then he vanished. The watering can fell on the Gruffle's head. Mr. Puffle shut the window quickly and put his hand in front of his eyes. There's nothing there, he said to himself. I just imagined it, or else I ate too much supper last night and I'm not very well. Mr. Puffle shut the window. He opened his fingers and looked through them. He looked out of the window. There was no one in the lane. The Gruffle had vanished. Mr. Puffle gave a great sigh. Just as I thought, he said. There's nothing there. I imagined it. But he locked the window and he didn't open it again that day. Mr. Puffle looked out of the window. There was no one in the lane. Mrs. Pitter-Patter was sitting in her front room having breakfast. She wasn't doing anything that would make the Gruffle angry. She was just having a cup of tea. But by this time the Gruffle was so cross that it made him angry just to see anyone. The Gruffle looked in through the window and saw Mrs. Pitter-Patter. Only his ears were showing. The rest of him was still invisible. He was feeling very grumpy indeed, and he didn't like the look of Mrs. Pitter-Patter at all. Mrs. Pitter-Patter was having a cup of tea. The Gruffle looked in at the window. He saw Mrs. Pitter-Patter. The Gruffle gave a great roar, and all of him came into view. He stood there at the window looking in. He roared loudly, and then he roared again. The Gruffle roared. He roared and roared again. Mrs. Pitter-Patter looked up and saw a big red monster looking in at the window. She dropped her cup and fainted. Mrs. Pitter-Patter looked up. She saw a big red monster. The Gruffle was just going to roar again when he heard a little squeak behind him. He turned around and saw a little mouse sitting in the middle of the lane. The Gruffle's roar changed to a yell of fright. There was only one thing the Gruffle was afraid of, and that was a mouse. The Gruffle saw a little mouse sitting in the lane. In a moment, the Gruffle had vanished. He rushed back down the lane into the garden and banged the gate behind him. The little mouse ran up the wall of Mrs. Pitter-Patter's house. Her breakfast was still on the table. The little mouse went in. The Gruffle vanished. He ran away down the lane. The little mouse went into Mrs. Pitter-Patter's house. Mrs. Pitter-Patter was lying back in her chair. The little mouse climbed up onto the table and helped himself to Mrs. Pitter-Patter's breakfast. Then he sat up and combed his whiskers, and then he left. The little mouse sat on the table. When Mrs. Pitter-Patter woke up, she looked all around the room, but there was no one there. Mrs. Pitter-Patter made herself a cup of tea, and when she had drunk it, she made herself another cup, and then she made another. She did nothing else for the rest of the day. Mrs. Pitter-Patter woke up. She made herself a cup of tea,